Welcome to another episode of Candid Canvas. I am your host, Julie Siegrist, the owner and artist of Julianet Studios. This is the space where we talk about and delve into creativity in all of its facets, from where creativity comes from to how to get it to flourish and the actual process of making great masterpieces. I thought it would be really fun to dive into a little bit of actual art history. Art history has never been one of my favorite subjects, so I hesitated to even start this topic, but I started researching, and the more I got into it, the more interested I became in it, and that is women of art history, because they are so often overlooked in art history textbooks and in culture. And once I really got into learning about them and their lives and their processes, I really just wanted to keep diving in further. So that is why the last episode and the upcoming episodes have taken me a little bit longer to record and release for all of you guys, is because I really wanted to go all the way back to the beginning, starting in the early ancient ages of art and the world, and actually focus on a couple of specific women in the different ages and highlight them and showcase them. So it's taken me a little bit longer to do that research and put everything together, but I am happy to bring you on this journey with me. And I thought there's no better place to start than at the very beginning. So sit down and get comfortable, because we're going to dive all the way in and go all the way back to the beginning of time. And I'm gonna try and make this as fun as possible for you guys, but it is going to be very um, history forward, and I hope that that is something that you're going to enjoy, because I really am excited to share my research with you. And so let's just get into it and rewind the clock all the way back to the prehistoric period. We would start in the Paleolithic era, which, as one might guess, doesn't have a whole lot of actual records or any written documentation of specific artists, or even culture itself is still very um, unknown of that time, and we are still discovering new things about the cultures of that day. And one of the most recent discoveries from the prehistoric and Paleolithic area specifically was found by an archaeologist named Dean Snow from the Pennsylvania State University. He analyzed hand stencils found in 8 different cave sites in France and Spain, and comparing the relative lengths of certain fingers on the hands in those stencils. He used his research to determine a ratio that revealed that 3/4 of the handprints in those caves were female, which is contrary to what we have most commonly believed about cave paintings, and that they were used by the men of the tribes of that day for hunting purposes, which they still might have been, but it's also possible, and according now to research, more likely that a lot of those paintings and cave drawings were by women, potentially for storytelling purposes um, in those family units. So, really, for thousands of years, women have been integral to the creation of art, playing a significant role in producing various forms of art, from figurines and carvings to cave paintings. Women have always been involved in art throughout history, as we can see. However, their contributions have often been overlooked, undervalued, and often misappropriated, which is why I am so excited to shine a spotlight on these artists in this podcast today. Before I go any further, I did want to mention that on my Patreon, my Juliana Studios Patreon, there is a tier for Candid Canvas listeners to become part of the Candid Canvas crew for only $3 a month. And that would give you access to all of the guides I have created to go along with this podcast series that gives some short synopsis for each era and also lists some of the women that I'm talking about in this podcast, as well as some that I have not talked about, and will also have some pictures and imagery of their artworks, which is really hard to translate through an audio podcast. So, if you would like to really get a look at what these artworks are and the different styles of each artist, that is a great option that I have created for you. And even if you don't want to subscribe to the Patreon, they are available in my Patreon shop for $5 each for each of the different chunks of eras that I'm going to be talking about. So head on over there. Once again, that's at Juliana Studios on Patreon under Candid Canvas Crew, or the shop to find the guides separately available for purchase. And with that, we will move ahead to the Neolithic era. When we get to the Neolithic era, we'll see that women continued to create in various forms, one notable example being pottery. The pottery of the Minoans and Mycenaeans were often decorated with intricate patterns and designs, and the creation of pottery was a highly skilled craft. The women played a significant role in the development and production of pottery. The Minoans and Mycenaeans being two ancient cultures that were known for their artistic achievements in various media, including pottery, sculpture, and fresco painting. Both men and women made important contributions in these creative endeavors. In Minoan culture, women produced pottery, textiles, and metalwork. They were involved at every stage of the pottery making process, from digging the clay to shaping the pots, firing, and decorating them. Minoan textiles were made from wool, flax, and silk, and they were often decorated with intricate patterns and designs. And the women were responsible for spinning the fibers into yarn, weaving and dyeing it, and were also skilled metal workers, creating jewelry and decorative objects from gold, silver, and bronze. And the Mycenaean women, like the Minoans, did much of the same. As we can see from the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, it's important to recognize that women have played a vital part in the evolution of jewelry and metalworking throughout history. In ancient Egypt, women were responsible for creating detailed gold and silver jewelry that was often buried with the dead as a form of wealth and status. And their contributions to that craft have been invaluable. One other interesting thing to know about ancient Egypt was that women had legal equality all the way back to 2750 BCE, they could own property, sign documents, and leave their property to whoever they wanted, which made it a lot easier for women to participate in creative endeavors at that time because they weren't held to such strict standards of what their expectations were in the household at that time. It's bizarre to think about how women in ancient Egypt had more rights than women in the US did in 1950. They could weave baskets and ground up minerals for paint and were even boat pilots. But they were still responsible for most house chores, like making bread every morning, and essential in the production of linen. Linen was highly, highly valued in Egypt for its strength, durability, and coolness, and women were responsible for almost every stage of the production process. From planting the crops to harvesting them, processing it, weaving it, and dyeing it, they were the powerhouse for the production of this treasured fiber. In Sudan, the Nubian women had a long and distinguished history of crafting breathtaking ceramic pots. These pots were used for storing and were both intricate and ornate. The Nubian women have passed down their traditional techniques from generation to generation for centuries. When we move ahead a little bit to the classical period, which was about 800 BCE to 500 CE, women persisted in creating art in various forms. Greek society of that era, however, was known for its patriarchal tendencies, where men held most of the power and were expected to be the great thinkers of that day and spend their time surrounded by their peers coming up with new ideas and creating art to showcase those ideas. Women were restricted to the domestic sphere. Nonetheless, some women challenged these societal conventions and made noteworthy contributions to the art world. Their legacy continues to influence the art world even today. Some notable female artists, like the poet Sappho and the painter Irene of Athens, were just a couple that made their mark. Although there were plenty of women artists, they seldom signed their names or otherwise identified their work. One person, though, Pliny the Elder, documented his view of the world in his treatise on a natural history, identifying several female artists as part of his chapters on art history. So we have him to thank for knowing some of the female artists of that day. Timarete was known for her paintings of the goddess Diana at Ephesus, and Irina was known and renowned for her paintings of the goddess Athena, which received high praise from her contemporaries. Myrtis was an exceptional artist known for her poetic prowess. She was highly regarded for her elegies and epigrams. Sappho was another renowned poet, often referred to as the poetess, much like Homer is the poet. Her poetry was characterized by its emotional depth and romantic themes of love and desire. Her contributions to the world of literature have left an incredible and indelible mark on the cultural landscape, and her legacy is a testament to the power of creative expression. The artist Fern was a sculptor of great renown. Her most notable creation was the statue of the goddess Aphrodite, which was celebrated for its breathtaking beauty. Similar to Greece, the society of China at that time was also patriarchal, and little artwork from ancient China is attributed to a specific artist. The role of women artists from that time needs to be better documented, leaving historians with needing to look for the influence of women in different ways. Spindle whorls were buried with women from that day, suggesting that they were weavers, and women of that time were also known to be poets. Ban Zhao was one of the early famous female writers, and her most well-known work was Nuje, or Instructions for Women. explaining the four virtues women were expected to follow: speech, virtue, behavior, and work. Some women could become successful writers and painters or pursue other arts, but generally these women were in wealthy families or married to men who were influential in society. Ancient Japan's artistic history is similarly rich and diverse, and Japan placed a high value on art, with a rich tradition in painting, calligraphy, and poetry. Murasaki Shikibu emerged as a prominent writer and poet. Her masterpiece, The Tale of Genji, is widely regarded as one of the greatest works of Japanese literature. When we shift over to the ancient Americas, we see that in many Native American tribes, women played an essential role in developing art and culture. The Native American women participated in day-to-day tribal politics and government development, which remained unchanged for centuries. Women were also responsible for the children, the household, controlling agricultural production, creating homes, clothing, pots, tools, and tanning hides to create clothes, and adding beads to create intricate repetitive patterns or images of animals. Weaving was an essential and widespread craft in ancient Mesoamerica. An area of famous female artists from the era was the Teotihuacan community. And I apologize for any mispronunciations. I promise I am trying my best. They were known for their weaving and embroidery skills, and their work was highly sought after. Their embroidery was particularly famous, and they created many beautiful works of art that depicted scenes from Aztec mythology and daily life. We're now going to move another continent over to ancient Africa, where it has long been a widespread belief that there were no female artists in Africa before 1800, which is inaccurate. There were many talented and skilled female artists throughout the continent's history. However, their work may not have been as widely recognized or celebrated as male counterparts. One reason for the lack of recognition is the art produced by African women before the 20th century was practical and functional, rather than purely decorative and artistic. Women in many African cultures were responsible for creating pottery, textiles, and other everyday items that their families and communities used, while these objects were often beautifully crafted and decorated. They were not always viewed as art, like painting or sculpture. Another reason for the lack of recognition in 1800 Africa that many of these cultures did not have Another reason for the lack of recognition in a pre-1800 Africa is that many of these cultures did not have a tradition of individualized or signature-based art, making it really challenging to identify specific artists. Art usually was produced collaboratively or anonymously. It's also worth noting that many of the written records and historical accounts from pre-1800 Africa were created by men, and may, therefore, be biased and not accurately reflect the contributions and achievements of female artists in recent years. Art historians and scholars have worked to uncover and recognize the work of previously overlooked female artists in Africa, and to reevaluate how art and creativity were understood and valued within these cultures. The early artists of this world created art for various reasons, including communication, spirituality, aesthetic appreciation, historical record keeping, socialization, identity formation, and personal development. Art has played a vital role in human culture, and its importance continues to today. And to wrap up today's episode, I want us to jump another continent yet again. From Africa, we go back up to Europe, and now it is a little darker, a little bit more medieval. A time when most people still couldn't read, But the church wanted to spread the word of the Bible, and the best way to do that was with imagery and with art. So during this time, art was usually based on religious concepts and images to teach biblical stories to illiterate masses. Artistic endeavors were usually run in workshops, which were family run or by nuns in convents. And much of the surviving information about art from female artists of those times was from the convents. Paintings were done in churches or on illuminated manuscripts, which were stories either of biblical text or of prophetic visions, which then were illustrated along the sides. And one of the most revered painters of illuminated manuscripts was Hildegard of Bingen. She was from Germany, and she wrote about visions that she had. Her works included medical information, visionary messages, and philosophical theories. She became a well-known composer of sacred music, and more of her liturgical charts have survived than any other medieval composer. She wrote letters, poems, and put her extensive writings into illuminated manuscripts. Another form of art that was prominent during this time was embroidery, and nuns or other women that were part of art houses would create embroidered tapestries that were intricate and depicted usually scenes on them. Embroidery became a suitable occupation and pastime for women of that era, and ordinary women would embroider for their families, but larger estates would establish workshops and hire local women to increase their production. There were many embroidery workshops in England, and English embroidery was famous throughout Europe. And that is where we are going to wrap up this episode, which is just part one of this series on women in art throughout history. And when we come back in the next episode, we will be talking about, of course, the Enlightenment, the resurgence of art, the Renaissance, and the eras to follow. So please join me again next time here at Candid Canvas. You can find me on Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram at Candid Canvas Pod. And don't forget that you can find the guides to follow along with this specific series on this podcast on my Julianet Studios Patreon under the tier Candid Canvas Crew, or in the shop to purchase them individually. And I want to thank you so much for joining me. This is so fun for me to talk about and share the research that I did with you, which I also had so much fun doing. And I can't wait to continue to talk about the cool, awesome, kick-ass women who stood up against societal norms and created art because they loved to do so. So until next time, see you.